Welcome back everybody. We're now ready to start the final circle of the wheel, and we're going to be doing stitches which can be used for borders, edges, outlines. Obviously there is some overlap with the stitches that we've already done, and stitches like coral knot stitch and the palestrina stitch, for example, could also be used for outlines. So there is going to be some overlap. We're going to start off with stem stitch and outline stitch. Stem stitch is most obviously used for stems, but I've used it here to outline my hexagons on the blackwork honeybees. So you can see that it's quite good for borders around shapes. Outline stitch is very similar. It's the same stitch really, except that the threads lie in a different direction. I'm going to show you both. Stem stitch can also be used to cover larger areas, for example these trees and branches here, and these are just rows of stem stitch done next to each other, and it works quite well when they're shaded, as you can see here. We're going to look at stem stitch first, and I've drawn some little shapes here. They're meant to be sort of pea pod shapes, but we'll see how they develop. And we're going to do one in stem stitch and one in outline stitch, and I'm going to explain the differences between the two stitches. So if you're right-handed, come up, you're stitching left to right, come up at the left of this line here. We're going to do the line first and take a stitch down onto the line, and then don't pull your thread all the way through, but come up in the middle of those two threads on the line. Then take a stitch down, and this time come up at the end of that previous stitch, not in the middle. So it's only on the first stitch that you come up in the middle. Now I'm keeping my thread at the bottom all the time. That's important for stem stitch, if you're right-handed, that is. So take a stitch down, and come up next to that previous stitch. So always with your thread at the bottom. It's obviously important to keep your stitches of the same length if you can. And then when you get to the end, just take your needle straight down like that. And what we're going to do is we're going to do rows of stem stitch to complete this shape. So take your thread through your stitches at the back and come up again just a little bit to the right of where you started, because we're trying to do a shape, it's not a rectangle. And then we're going to do another line underneath. And when you're filling shapes and you're right-handed, it's a good idea to start at the top and work downwards, because the thread lies at the bottom, so it's easier to work this way. But you can do it either way. So this is just a very simple demonstration of filling a shape with stem stitch. I will show left-handers later on, because for left-handers you don't keep your thread at the bottom, so wait for that demonstration. And go down. Now, because I'm filling a shape, I'm going to do the bottom edge first, because I don't want it to just look, I want it to look like a vegetable, a sort of more natural. So I'm going to do this bottom edge first. I would only do this when I'm doing a shape that is irregular. If you've got branches that are the same width, you would always go down from the top. And now take your thread across the back and come up again, and I'm going to go up here. I'm going to do a separate demonstration about stem stitch for straight lines and curves. So really when you're looking to do just a single line of stem stitch rather than fill a shape. Now there might just be one more row I can get in at the bottom there. Okay, that's completed. Now we're going to do the next one in outline stitch. Then I'm going to show left-handers, and then I'm going to show you on lines and curves and give you a bit of advice about that. Outline stitch is almost exactly the same stitch, except that instead of keeping your thread at the bottom, your thread is at the top. So it just means that the stitches lie in the other direction. That is the only difference. So when you're outlining something, it's a good idea to work out which stitch is the best. And I'll show you some lines and curves shortly, and that will help you to understand what I'm talking about. I'm going to complete this in the same way, but using outline stitch this time, and then I'll come back and show left-handers. Stem stitch for left-handers is done differently in that you're stitching from right to left, and you need to keep your thread at the top. So take a stitch down, and then come up in the middle of those two threads just for your first stitch. So keep your thread at the top, take a stitch down, and this time don't pull that thread all the way through, come up next to that previous stitch. So take a stitch down, and come up next to the previous stitch. Like that. When you're working shapes as a left-hander, you might find it easier to work from the bottom up rather than top down, but you can do it either way. And then if you were to be doing outline stitch, your thread you're still stitching right to left, but your thread will stay at the bottom. Like that. Now just a word about curves. Try and stick to either stem stitch or outline stitch for the same piece of work, but you can almost determine which will be the best dependent on which way your curves go and which way up you have your work. So if I were doing a curve that goes this way, it would be far better for me to use stem stitch than outline stitch, because my thread is at the bottom and it naturally gets trapped while I'm stitching. It lies naturally more neatly. Can you see what I mean? That thread there is lying naturally on that curve. If I were to do an outline stitch here, you can see what I mean. You get the thread almost going across the shape, and it doesn't look very tidy. So if you've got a curve on a single line like this, you're better doing your stem stitch. If the curve goes the other way, so for example the one below here, then you would be better doing outline stitch. So let me just show you that. So that the thread gets trapped at the top here. Obviously if you're left-handed, you need to think of it in the other direction. So if you're left-handed, you'd be better doing stem stitch here and outline stitch there. So this is outline stitch. Now obviously you could turn this round and do stem stitch from the other direction, but it's just worth thinking about the curves and which stitch would look better. The only other thing I'd say about stem stitch and outline stitch is that when you've got very sort of sharp curves and sharp angles to cover, is that you make your stitches smaller, and that will look neater. You can also whip stem stitch in the same way that we whipped the split back stitch earlier. So I hope that you've enjoyed that. I'm going to just put a few little stitches in the bottom of my P shape on my wheel, and I'll show you that. Just to finish off these little what are supposed to be P shapes here, I'm going to put a little fly stitch in the bottom. So up on the left, down on the right, up through the middle. I'm using a brown because I can't find anything better. You could use a darker green if you've got one, and I'll just do a little stitch at the end there. So I think that finishes it off nicely, and the same on the other one. And just a little stitch down. So the next stitch is going to be raised stem band, and that's often used in stump work, so come back and join me for that.